Now, an average of 46 children are raped daily in South Africa. At least 2 are killed daily as well. Many know of or suspect that a child has been abused. Most do nothing about it. Why are people afraid to report child abuse? Would it make a difference? Tonight, we have Teddy Bear Clinic Director Shahida Omar in our Johannesburg studio. She is with me right now. And also, we've got Lucy Jameson, Senior Researcher at the UCT Children's Institute. She's in our Cape Town studio. Ladies, thank you so much for joining me. Shahida, if I may start with you. A very simple question. Why are some people reluctant to actually report child abuse?
Well, I think there are many reasons that people are reluctant. People are, they fear reprisal, and people are also complacent and complicit, where they don't want to get involved, but there's also fear of repercussions. What if they have a backlash? What if it's not true? So there are other, these are some of the reasons that people are reluctant to get involved.
And it's, when we spew out some of those numbers I've just given out as well, when it comes to South Africa, your experience, what are the, the more prevalent types of abuse that we're seeing?
So we're seeing a lot of physical abuse, a lot of sexual abuse, and I think just to add to your figures, the recent stats that was released over the 3 years from 2016 to 2018, 41% of reported incidents of rape was committed on children. So that indicates that it's quite prevalent, and we're finding that this is on the increase. But of course, physical abuse, we've just heard recently in this week, a child stabbing another child at the Forest High School, and it was fatal. And that's just one of many other incidences. So physical, and with physical and sexual, of course, emotional is the underlying thing that is usually not overt, but it's covert, and it has as much as a harmful and detrimental effect on children.
That's very true. Let me go to Lucy Jameson, Senior Researcher, UCT Children's Institute in Cape Town. I want to stay on that emotional abuse, the factor that Shahida is talking about here, and that it is incredibly difficult to actually, see a child who's, how do you see that the child is actually emotionally abused? Let's say you're a school teacher or you're a family member, and how do you approach a child to actually discuss something of that nature?
Well, it's very difficult, and it has to be done very gently. You have to make sure that the child feels safe. You have to reassure them that you're acting in their best interest. And then often a child might not actually know that they are being abused. So you have to familiarize them with the concept. You have to build that trust, because often children won't disclose in the first instance. So you may have to create a situation where you come back repeatedly to the child. And I just want to add to what you've said about the different forms of violence. So many children in this country also witness domestic violence where parents are fighting with each other or mum is experiencing violence at home. And that has just as detrimental effect on children's development as actually experiencing violence. And in a long-term study in Soweto, when you added all those different forms of violence together, they actually saw that 99% of children had experienced or witnessed violence. So this really is a huge problem.
What are the social pressures when we look at the community itself and maybe the parents, that some of these parents or the communities are actually facing or forcing them to actually treat their kids in this manner, or to just ignore what's actually happening to their children or to the children around them?
Well, so as I said, because this violence is so widespread, both violence against children, violence against women. Here in Cape Town, we have high levels of gang and community violence. It's part of everyone's everyday experience. It's become normalized. So people often will see violence and not even react to it because they're not recognizing that this is something that's wrong or out of the ordinary. So it's difficult to recognize, and then people, as Shahida had said, are frightened about the reaction that they might experience, or they simply don't know what to do and how to intervene.
Shahida, only 21% of child rape cases and only 1 in 3 murder cases involving children resulted in successful convictions. That's surely a problem.
Indeed, and I think just picking up when we said the fear of reprisal, Lucy mentioned that also. I think people are, why it's frequently reported, it's underreported because of the reception received by law enforcement agencies. So when victims and their families go and report to the police station, they often do not get the kind of reception that is conducive to the disclosure that is made and a statement that is made. And that in itself turns victims away because police officers sometimes delay the process of taking a statement. We had a child that had to went to the police station and waited and was told to return, so had to wait and stay in the same clothes for 2 days, a victim of alleged rape. So it's those kind of situations where victims have been transported in the same vehicle like the alleged perpetrator, and that is certainly a deterrent for families and victims not to go forth with making disclosures or going forth and reporting. So those are some of the things. That is why we're sitting with 21%. And even going onto the court roll, they're only taking on cases that stands a high chance of being convicted. So they'll put those cases on the roll.
But don't these first responders get some sort of training?
They do get training, but I think what we need to understand is that there's a high staff turnover. The stress levels are very high, and often we find that people are on stress leave, officers are on stress leave, they've got substitutes or people in their place, and I think that there is training, but it's not consistent and regular. And sometimes they recruit staff from other departments and they're not trained.
Lucy, let me come to you once again. In your research, can you just illustrate a case maybe where you came across where an alarm was actually raised? Just going back to the issue of, some families that actually don't report these cases, where an alarm was raised and that actually saved a child.
You know, we see that happening all the time. So the Children's Institute is actually on the grounds of the Red Cross Hospital here in Cape Town. At Red Cross, they're identifying 50 cases of child abuse a month. And they're very lucky at Red Cross to actually have a multidisciplinary team where the medics and the social workers actually support each other. And you have children coming in with burns, severe physical injuries, where the social workers will pick that up. They make sure that the child isn't returned to a situation where their lives would be at risk. And that we see as a process that's working well here in Cape Town. Unfortunately, in other institutions and other parts of the country, we see that often doctors will not report to the police or to social services for many of the same reasons that Shahida explained, why community members are reticent, because they're frightened of reprisals, because they're not sure how to properly identify children, or because they're just extremely busy and they don't want to take on the extra work. And in those situations, we have seen children go home, be returned to abusive parents, and end up dead several months later. So, as I say, putting systems in place, we've seen in Cape Town at the Red Cross Children's Hospital working extremely effectively.
Now, in South Africa, we've got fantastic laws, fantastic legislation. You look at Section 28 in the Constitution of South Africa. It states every child has a right to family care, parental care, or to appropriate alternative care when removed from the family environment. Tell us about that alternative care when a child is actually removed from an abusive environment. Is that good enough? What are we talking about? The social services, basically, is what I'm asking. Are we up to par?
So the short answer on that is that our social services are overburdened. when about 10, 15 years ago, we started to have large numbers of children being orphaned due to the HIV/AIDS epidemic, the Department of Social Development decided that those children who were living with granny or aunt would be eligible to be put in foster care. And because of that policy decision, we now see that there's over 400,000, at the peak it was over 500,000 children who were in foster care, but with a relative because their parents had died. Now those children obviously have needs, and their need for support, a need for counselling, but that put an enormous strain on the child protection system, and it meant that social workers who are supposed to be dealing with a maximum of 60 cases were dealing with upwards of 200 cases, and the abuse cases get lost. It's very difficult to prioritise when you are extremely overstretched and overworked, and what we're seeing today is that cases are falling through the cracks. We are seeing that the police and social services and the Department of Health are not working together, so that criminals are getting away with abuse, children and families are not being supported, and they're not getting access to therapeutic services. And in the long term, children who've suffered from that kind of trauma are likely to go on either to become abusers themselves, or in the case of girls, they're very likely to become involved in abusive relationships because they've internalized that sense of, I deserve it.
All right, Lucy, thank you so much. Doctor, just one last one for you. Just quick advice for somebody who thinks they may be witnessing this type of abuse taking place in whatever environment they're in. What should they do? What's the first thing a person should do?
Well, I think firstly the legislation is very clear on that. The Children's Act speaks very clear to that, Section 110, and the Sexual Offences Legislation, Section 54, with sexual offences. It has to be reported. Recognition of abuse, reporting and referral. That reporting is mandatory. It's not a moral obligation, it's a legal obligation. And failure to report constitutes a criminal offense. But I think furthermore, if we look at the morality of the situation, failure to report it could cost the life of a child, and the loss of the life of one child is the loss of the lives of many children. So people need to report, because if they act in good faith, there is no recourse, and they will not be subjected to any legal recriminations. I think that is important for people to appreciate and understand and respond.
All right, thank you so much. Dr. Shahida Omar, Director of Teddy Bear Clinic, and also Lucy Jameson, who was talking to us from Cape Town, a senior researcher at UCT Children's Institute. Thank you so much, ladies, for taking the time to speak with us.